Imagine living in a place where something as simple as smiling in public, wearing jeans, or even choosing a hairstyle could put you at risk. In North Korea, the laws go beyond any conventional notion of control and are enforced with a surreal level of rigor. Every detail of life, from the smallest to the most mundane, is under constant surveillance by the state. In a country where the government dictates even how you should think and feel, freedom is nearly a non-existent concept. Want to know just how far this can go? With each bizarre law, reality seems to move further from what we know. In this video, you'll discover how these unusual rules shape the daily lives of North Koreans, revealing a world where freedom is suppressed, but silent resistance endures. In the rigid and almost impenetrable landscape of North Korea, state control over citizens' lives goes beyond any usual notion of order. Under Kim Jong-un's command, all aspects of life are meticulously regulated, and even the smallest daily actions may be observed and judged. Imagine a place where even the most trivial activities, like where you walk or who you talk to, are under constant watch. In this environment, people live in a constant state of alert, always careful not to break any invisible rule that could come at a high cost. This creates a climate of tension that few can even begin to imagine. But how does one survive in a society where every personal choice could be scrutinized? Take walking as an example. In other countries, walking around the city is a common, often thoughtless activity, yet there, it's an action that must be measured and calculated. A simple stroll could be interpreted as an act of defiance if it doesn't align with government permissions. In this way, people end up living in a state of forced conformity, where authentic choices become a distant memory. Curiously, this rigidity eventually becomes normal for those who experience this reality. Life in Pyongyang, the center of the strictest control, perfectly illustrates the weight of this surveillance. Every individual bears the duty to act within the regime's expectations, as if on a perpetual stage. When the gaze of dictatorship imposes itself on even the most insignificant details, the lines between personal freedom and duty to the state blur into something like a tightrope walk, where a misstep could be costly. It's ironic and somewhat paradoxical that this very tension between freedom and submission ends up shaping society in a way that sustains the regime. The strictness in North Korea doesn't stop at daily control. It intensifies even more when it comes to punishments. Any misstep, no matter how small, can lead to severe consequences, sometimes even death. Imagine a place where a minor infraction, like dozing off during a meeting, could be taken so seriously that the death penalty is an option. Here, punishments are imposed as examples, not only as retribution but as a continuous reminder to every citizen to stay in line. It's almost as if every gesture carries the weight of a life-altering decision. In this society, everyday actions can turn into traps. Anyone who strays even slightly from imposed norms risks being marked, or even eliminated. Let's say someone chooses to make a simple complaint about an absurd rule, something most people worldwide would do without a second thought. This comment could be seen as a direct affront to the regime. With such an extreme punishment system, fear becomes a constant shadow, keeping people in absolute obedience, almost as if survival depended on remaining unnoticed. In fact, this atmosphere of fear turns punishment into something nearly ordinary in North Koreans' lives. During a meeting, anyone deviating from the party's standards is seen as a risk. In a culture where errors are not just repressed but also used to educate the group, every punishment serves as a dark reminder of what disobedience means. In this context, every individual walks with extra caution, knowing that even the smallest lapse could bring consequences no one is willing to face. When it comes to freedom of movement, North Korea exists in a universe of its own. For decades, the government imposed rigid restrictions, even banning bicycles in Pyongyang, something seen as a common form of transportation elsewhere. There were times when women were entirely forbidden from riding bicycles, considered immoral for choosing something so trivial. It's fascinating to imagine a society where transportation options are shaped by state-imposed morality, forcing people to adapt and accept these prohibitions as part of daily life. Imagine, for example, the rarity of cars on the streets, where most people aren't even allowed to drive. Those chaotic traffic scenes common in many cities simply don't exist. Here, each vehicle is a privilege restricted to a few, typically connected to the government. For women, the simple act of driving can be interpreted as a transgression of norms, a kind of departure from what the regime considers appropriate. This control ends up making mobility a factor of hierarchy, where only a few have access to even the most basic privileges. This limited mobility transforms the pace of daily life. The lack of transportation options keeps everyone close and contained, with neighborhoods and communities connected not just by distance but by a sense of confinement. It's almost as if every corner is an invisible barrier, reminding citizens of the limits of their freedom to move. This constant restriction leaves a mark on the routines and desires of those who live there, creating an environment where even moving around becomes a moral and political issue. In North Korea, even clothing choices are rigorously controlled, reflecting the regime's disdain for any hint of Western influence. Jeans, for example, are banned because they're seen as a symbol of Western culture, something the government considers a direct threat to local values. Wearing jeans is not just a style choice. It's an act that can be seen as rebellion. And in a country where every element of public and private life is under the state's eye, even the fabric you wear carries political implications. The clothing restrictions go beyond fabric or style. Women, for instance, are discouraged from wearing pants and are expected to wear attire the regime deems decent. Imagine the impact in a society where every piece of clothing is chosen not for comfort or self-expression but for what it politically represents. A simple dress or jacket can become a statement, even if unintentional, of alignment or divergence from what the government approves. And in this way, personal style disappears, replaced by an imposed code. This form of control gradually shapes citizens' behavior and sense of identity. People dress not to express themselves, but to avoid problems, in an attempt to remain invisible under the regime's critical eye. Ironically, while the government tries to suppress any external influence, it ends up reinforcing a type of uniformity that stifles individual expression. Fashion, in this case, becomes a matter of survival, where the choice isn't how to stand out but how to conform. In North Korea, even something as simple as a haircut is an act of compliance with the regime. There's a list of approved hairstyles for men and women, each carefully selected to reflect what the state considers appropriate. Men, for instance, must keep their hair short, aligned with the government-approved style. For women, hair length is linked to marital status. Only married women can wear their hair longer. Each strand that deviates from this norm becomes a calculated risk. It may seem absurd, but for them this is daily life. The regime uses these regulations to ensure that even the population's appearance conforms to a socialist aesthetic, avoiding any sign of external influence. Imagine if, instead of choosing a hairstyle based on personal taste, people were forced to pick from styles chosen by a distant official. This regulation affects not only freedom of expression but also personal identity. This restriction shapes North Koreans' perception of appearance. Over time, certain characteristics become associated with correct or incorrect behaviors, and hairstyle becomes a matter of loyalty. The act of grooming each morning ceases to be a personal ritual, turning into a reminder of belonging to a larger group, where appearance reflects party ideals. It's as if, in the mirror, each person sees not just themselves but a reflection of the regime's expectations. In North Korea, communicating with the outside world is practically a crime, with severe consequences for those who try to break this barrier. International calls are forbidden, and those who dare make one, even in emergencies, risk severe penalties, including the death penalty. It's hard to imagine a world where a simple call to a distant relative becomes a dangerous act. But for North Koreans, this is an inescapable reality. This deprivation not only isolates the country but creates an emotional barrier for those who have family abroad. This prohibition goes beyond limiting international connections. It shapes the population's perception of what they're allowed to know and what must remain hidden. Any external contact could threaten the narrative the regime has built about the world. Imagine living in a place where your only knowledge of the outside world comes from government-controlled news, painting a specific and rarely realistic picture. In this context, an international call is more than just communication. It's a door to the unknown, a step outside of government control. This is precisely why the North Korean regime deals so harshly with those who attempt external contact. Every attempt at communication becomes an act of resistance, a search for something beyond the invisible walls that enclose the country. By banning calls, the government reinforces the population's isolation, keeping them oblivious to global changes and news. Thus, the regime not only keeps the people isolated from the world, but also keeps the world isolated from its people. In North Korea, the concept of home goes far beyond the walls where one lives. Housing is entirely state-controlled, with the government deciding where each citizen should reside, based on their status, function, and loyalty to the regime. There is no freedom of choice as many know it. Moving to a new neighborhood or city is nearly impossible unless some favor is granted, often through bribery. Thus, where someone lives reflects not only their position in society but also their alignment with the party. For those living under this system, the value of a home is measured not only by space or condition but by what it represents in terms of privilege. Those living in Pyongyang, for example, are viewed as more privileged since the capital is reserved for those closest to the government. However, this privilege comes at a cost. Surveillance and control are even more intense. In a place where housing is controlled by the regime, moving isn't just about opportunity but about power, alignment, and even subordination. This housing control reflects the government's desire to monitor every aspect of life, including social and family circles. Each neighbor is carefully positioned to create a constant network of observation, where everyone watches and is watched. Thus, what would be a family environment becomes an extension of the state, a space where privacy is limited, and the simple act of living becomes yet another reflection of conformity. The home, which should be a place of refuge, becomes an extension of government rules and control. In North Korea, even emotions are policed. On dates like the death anniversaries of past leaders, showing any inappropriate emotion, like smiles or laughter, is strictly forbidden. During these times, the population is expected to display absolute respect, and any slip-up, even a smile at the wrong moment, could be seen as disloyalty. Imagine having to control your facial expression, hiding feelings, and avoiding any gesture that could be viewed as disrespectful. The emotional weight of these restrictions is almost tangible, and the silence on the streets speaks louder than any words. This repression of feelings turns human experience into something more restricted, where even mourning is controlled and directed. On these days of mandatory homage, grief must be visible and palpable, like a public ritual of devotion. Even those who don't have an emotional connection to the regime must align and display what is expected. It's as if sorrow itself is used to solidify control, a constant reminder that even the heart is governed. It's a situation that reveals just how far the regime goes to maintain a narrative of worship and reverence. For those outside this context, it's difficult to imagine how this ban on emotions affects daily life. The simple act of smiling, something many do without thinking, becomes a risk, and laughter, often a symbol of joy and freedom, is suppressed. Thus, the days pass without spontaneous moments, where any public display of happiness must be measured and controlled. This constant emotional surveillance transforms social interactions, making people hide their true emotions and become versions of themselves molded by the regime. In the age of information, it's hard for most of us to imagine life without free internet access. In North Korea, however, the internet as we know it virtually doesn't exist. There's only an internal network, controlled by the government, which limits access to sites and information approved by the regime. This North Korean intranet restricts the population to a virtual world where everything is monitored and directed, preventing citizens from discovering what lies beyond the country's borders. For them, the internet is a distant, almost mythical reality. With this restriction, the government ensures that external influences don't penetrate society, keeping the narrative controlled. Imagine growing up without knowing there's a universe of information and opinions at your fingertips, limited only to what the state allows. The North Korean online experience is a carefully maintained bubble, where outside culture and values are almost invisible. It's a situation in which technology, instead of liberating and connecting, becomes just another tool of control. For those accustomed to free internet, the idea of a state-controlled network seems almost surreal. Imagine a place where you can't look up world news or access social media to talk to someone from another country. This digital isolation reinforces the physical isolation, creating a population that, for the most part, knows nothing about innovations, social movements, or even political realities occurring elsewhere. In this way, the government not only keeps the people isolated from the world, but also keeps the world isolated from its people. In North Korea, any form of religious belief is considered a threat to the state's power. Religion, seen as a form of loyalty that competes with devotion to the supreme leader, is strictly forbidden. There's no space for spiritual practices, and those who attempt to express their faith are harshly punished. It's a setting where the pursuit of something greater, common to so many cultures, is deemed subversive, and the act of believing becomes a danger to anyone daring to defy this ban. Religion ceases to be a personal choice and becomes a risky, underground act. The prohibition on religion replaces spiritual values with a near-religious devotion to the regime. The government, in a way, becomes the object of worship, with leaders revered as almost divine figures. Imagine a place where religious holidays and ceremonies are replaced by party anniversaries and leaders' birthdays. For North Korean citizens, these rituals create an intense connection to the regime, while any spiritual expression is erased, reinforcing the authority of the state over heart and mind. This suppression of religion profoundly affects society. The absence of spiritual freedom deprives people of a space where they could find comfort, hope, or meaning, values common in many cultures and religious traditions. In the absence of this relief, the only permitted solace is adherence to norms and the state's worship. It's a situation that depersonalizes faith, turning it into yet another reflection of the dominant ideology, where personal spirituality gives way to absolute control. After learning about these laws, the question remains, what would it be like to live in a place where every move is monitored, and even a smile could be risky? Imagine how your life would be if the state could dictate everything, from what you wear to what you think. North Korea's reality may seem distant, but it also reminds us of the importance of the freedoms we have. So, how about appreciating and defending these freedoms which are so easily lost? Leave a comment with what impacted you the most, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated. Here, you'll continue learning about topics that expand your worldview and spark your curiosity.